Metaphor ReFantazio released in October of 2024 for the PlayStation 5, the Xbox Series X, and the PC through Steam. As of the writing of this review, it is not available on the Nintendo Switch. Developed by Studio Zero and published by Atlus, Metaphor is a new IP with combat and gameplay similar to the Persona series and the Shin Megami Tensei series. So, is it worth playing in 2025? Especially when it retails for $70 US. This review is going to answer that question. If you're liking my content, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel.
どこまでも醜いな。これが種族が一つかのごとき理想郷か。叶わぬと悟った時に滅ぶべきだったのだ。
Alright, whether you enjoy this game or not comes down largely on whether you're a fan of JRPGs. I enjoyed Persona 4 and 5, and I thought Shin Megami Tensei 5 was alright, but you really needed to have that time to sink into playing games like this. These types of games from Atlus take anywhere from 60 to 100 hours to beat, even more if you want to 100% it or play on a higher difficulty. That is a commitment that I don't see most players putting into it. I beat Metaphor ReFantazio in 70 hours, doing all of the side quests and the follower missions. But I also played the first half of the game on normal difficulty before turning it down to easy mode in order to get this review done before I went on vacation. 70 hours is a very long time, especially when you're just picking away at it in small bits and chunks over the weeks as life and work take up priority. And that's where I think Metaphor suffers, because the length of the game lessens some of the story's impact. And I also feel like there's a lot of filler just for the sake of making the game longer. But we'll get more into that during the story and gameplay sections, but for now, let's talk about the technicals. Metaphor runs well on console. It stays at a pretty steady and consistent frame rate, and I didn't encounter a single bug or crash during my entire playthrough. Some of the loading times could be a little long, especially if you're getting into these big boss battles. It will take a few moments to get into the actual fight itself from the main world, but it's nothing terrible. For graphics, Metaphor is a mixed bag. The game has like 3 main graphic sections. That's what I'm going to call it for lack of a better word. You have the cutscenes, which are either in-game character models or anime show scenes, just like Persona 5 had. The anime parts are well done, but they're not in 4K, which can be noticeable at times, giving them a slight blurriness. The in-game cutscenes are usually just people standing around talking to each other. If there is a cutscene action, it's animated. If it's explanation and dialogue, it's in-game. The character models are just fine, and I didn't have any issues with them, although there's no personalization of your character's clothing or looks. But the landscapes in Metaphor leave a lot to be desired. There are times when the skyboxes are pretty incredible, with vast distances and a lot going on, but most of the dungeons are just cut and paste, using the same floor tiles and corridors over and over again, to the point that if it weren't for the map, you would be completely lost. This is similar to the Persona and the Shin Megami Tensei games, where they almost put no effort into most of the dungeons, just reusing them over and over again, or just simply changing the colors of walls but not the textures. If that was a turnoff for you in the past games, Metaphor does nothing to change that.
きっとできるさ。いつもそうだった。苦しい時に君がいたから、どんなことも乗り越えられた。叶えよう。君ならなれるよ。英雄に。
Okay, the story. What is Metaphor about? Well, it's a fantasy game. It's set in a magical world where instead of humans, there are 8 distinct types of races based on fantasy tropes, like elves and people with dog ears, that sort of thing. Metaphor is a game about racism and prejudice, and it's a really big deal in this world, with all of the tribes divided into social castes. Some of the races are on top, and a lot of them are on the bottom of society. It's so bad that some of the tribes aren't allowed going into cities, or holding certain types of jobs, that sort of thing. You play as the protagonist, whose name you can choose, but whose appearance is preset. You don't know much about his past, aside from the fact that they are friends with the prince who has been cursed and is currently in a coma. Helping you out is a fairy who helps guide you along the way, giving you hints about what to do and where to go. Think Navi from the Ocarina of Time. The game starts with the death of the king, which is not meant to be a mystery at all because the first scene in the game shows his murder. From there, your character is trying to break the curse on the prince by finding the person who cast it. You gain friends and followers along the way as you track down the culprit. Then, the game turns into this sort of race between a bunch of contestants trying to become the new king. See, when the king died, he cast a spell that turned him into a giant face that is floating above the capital. He then announced that whoever is the most popular person at the end of this contest would go on to become king. The goal of the game, at least for the first part, is to travel the world as a contestant, going to various cities to improve your popularity in order to become king and break the curse on the prince. That's as much of the story as I'm going to get into because I don't want to get into spoilers. But I will say the story is interesting, with a few mysteries and twists and turns that keep you on your toes. The characters are really well done and the villains are memorable. You will want to play through the entire game and get to the end so that everything is revealed. That said, the story does suffer from the game's length. The entire story has a sense of urgency to it. There's a threat that needs to be dealt with the end of the world at stake. But if you played any of the Persona games, you'll know that a large part of the game is building relationships with others as the days slowly pass. So you'll have this deadline for a quest. For example, stop the evil bad guy from destroying the world. And you'll need to complete it in like 20 days or the world ends. Your companions and everyone are pushing you to do it as quickly as possible because the consequences are terrible. But then you can chill out with your crew on the ship, taking baths and eating lunch until the deadline because you need to upgrade your character. Oddly enough, the cinematics make it seem like almost no time has passed between the climatic fights, making it like a seamless transition even though you just spent 2 weeks doing side quests and adventures. This isn't like an open world game where there's like a waypoint in the distance and the story is broken up by traveling the world and doing stuff. This is a deliberate slowing down of the story in a different way. It makes it extremely hard to have a compelling, high-stakes narrative when there are large chunks of slowdowns where you spend hours upon hours just side questing or talking to people about random stuff. That being said, while the main narrative suffers from these slowdowns, it allows your party and your side characters to shine. Each of them are very well crafted, well designed, and unique from each other. And the time spent speaking to them and doing their quests really builds up their personalities and gives you a lot of insights into their motivations. Some of the crew are more interesting than others though, but that's just a given when you have over a dozen side characters. But none of them feel like a waste of time. The game slowly introduces them over the course of the main storyline, meaning that you spent more time with early additions to your crew, while the later few can feel a little bit rushed. Overall, the story is good, but I think it would have been better and more impactful if they had streamlined it and took out a lot of that filler. It goes off the rails in the later half, leading to a lot of what the hell was that moments.
だと力ある者が義務を果たさず罪なき者が死んでいくそんなものが現実なら俺が全部壊してやるうわ我が名はレオンストロール・ダ・ハリエイタス民も領地も家族すらも今はない残ったものはただ一つこの身に流れる貴族の血貴様ら悪を打ち滅ぼす尊き者の使命だけだ
Gameplay-wise, Metaphor is a turn-based RPG with the same mechanics as the Persona games. You will have so many actions during your turn, then when those are over, it passes over to your enemy, who takes their turns, then back to you. If you miss an attack or an enemy blocks it, you lose so many of your action points. But if you strike an enemy's weakness, like somebody's weak to lightning and you use a lightning spell, you get an extra action. Combat in Metaphor can be very hard and tricky. This is a classic style JRPG, which means grinding for better equipment and levels is a must, especially if you play on a harder difficulty. Main story missions involve going into these long dungeons where you can only save in set locations throughout. There is a time limit in that you only have so many days to complete a task before you fail the game. Time only passes when you travel in the open world in your ship though. For example, say you want to travel to a temple to complete a quest of fighting a dragon. You may have like 20 days to beat that mission. Traveling to the temple will take some time, maybe a day or two, then going into the temple to explore it is always a day. That means you need to plan ahead, making sure you have time to complete everything you want to do within the limit. When you're in a dungeon, you can't leave without more time passing. And since you can only save in set rooms throughout the dungeon, you can leave when you get to those safe rooms, and then fast travel back if you want to leave the dungeon and come back. When you're in the dungeon, your health and magic points can only be restored by items or skills. That means when you save in a room, it doesn't renew your MP. Magic points are really the limiting factor on how far you can explore in a dungeon. Most enemies need skills to defeat them, and skills take MP. Run out and you need to use items to replenish it. But MP restoring items are rare and you can't buy that many of them in shops. So if you run out of MP and you don't have items to replenish it, you should leave the dungeon to rest and come back later. This time limit may feel like the game is pushing you to prioritize certain activities, and while it does feel that way, I found I always had plenty of time to do all the main quests, all the side quests, and all my follower quests. I even had like days left over. But again, it depends on the difficulty you play on. On hard, you may need to tackle dungeons in smaller chunks, making multiple trips. Now, your followers include your party members and people you meet throughout your journey. As you do side quests and side activities with them, your relationships deepen and you get rewards. These rewards are usually based on an archetype. Like a persona in a Persona game, archetypes are kind of like your class: wizard, knight, warrior, that kind of thing. Each archetype has their own strengths and weaknesses, their own skills, and their own equipment. They level up to rank 20, giving you mastery over them. You can then choose a new archetype to level or keep a mastered one in order to get an XP boost. The higher your relationship with a follower, the better archetypes you get access to. That means that maxing out your relationships is very important to beating the game. But what prevents you from just knocking out all of these follower quests right from the start is your kingly virtues. These are 5 stats that slowly increase as you do activities and quests that boost them. So for example, speaking in front of a crowd may increase your eloquence. They don't have an effect on anything besides being a limiter on how high you can boost your follower relationships levels. You may not be able to increase a follower rank until you have a level 5 wisdom, for example, or something like that. Also, there are no romance options in Metaphor. Unlike a Persona game, you can't romance any of the characters no matter what options you pick or dialogue you select. So that's pretty much the gameplay. Attack enemies, build relationships, do the main quests.
本当なのか王様が死んだって。
軍は葬式の支度に兵を取られて治安は最悪。ただでさえ妙な怪物が出るとかで兵隊が足りんのに。
怪物か。確かに近頃噂を聞くな。
おまけに王には世継ぎがいない。後釜争いで揉めるだろう。思いやられるぜ。
何
凱旋者
Alright, like I said, it took me 70 hours to beat Metaphor ReFantazio. That means I could talk about it for hours, but I don't want this review to be that long, so let's go through the pros and cons of Metaphor. For the pros, the story is pretty good, with a few mysteries to be solved and twists and turns to keep things interesting. There are over 70 hours of content here, possibly even over 100 hours, depending on the difficulty you play on and what achievements you're trying to get. The characters are really fleshed out and interesting, and the voice acting is great. There are a lot of different enemies to fight, and the boss monsters are well designed. There are a ton of accessibility options, so if you're finding things hard or confusing, the game will help you out. Whether that's auto-equipping weapons and armor, giving you tips, or lowering the difficulty. For the cons, the passing of days and the time limit mechanics can feel very out of place at times. It really lessens the sense of urgency in the later portion of the game, when world-ending stakes are put on hold so you can wash your clothes for an afternoon. The graphics of the dungeons are not great, there are a lot of empty spaces and reused tile sets and assets. If you've played Persona 4 Golden, then you know what to expect here. There are parts of the game that could be streamlined more. There are a lot of expository dialogue sections where everything grinds to a halt so they can explain to the player exactly what's happening. It makes it even worse when they re-explain obvious things just to make sure you aren't lost along the way. And that's it for another review. So, is Metaphor ReFantazio worth the price? Yes, it is. There is a ton of content here, and while it does have some flaws, overall the game is terrific. As a fan of Persona 4 and 5, Metaphor shook things up just enough to stand on its own, while keeping a lot of the things I enjoyed from the Persona series. And if it's on sale, it's an even better time to pick it up. I'm the Casual Console Gamer, and I'll see you all in the next review.